want to bring in my guest. He's here. As I pointed out to my audience before you got here, I am deeply fortunate for you to join me. Warwick Powell. Warwick Powell is an adjunct professor at Queensland University, a professor working on the intersection of China, digital technologies, supply chains, financial flows, and global political economy and governance. And for some reason, that doesn't do you justice. I was looking at your resume. How you doing, man? You doing okay today?
I'm doing okay. It's been a busy day. What about yourself?
Yeah, it's been a long day, but everything's all right. Everything's good. I want to start with this trade deal between the EU and the United States. I was going over your articles on this. I want to play something for you. So this was, where is it? Was it von der Leyen who said this? No. Listen to right here, Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is effectively talking about tariffs for the rest of the world, meaning, hey, you got this deal that's pretty brutal to Europe. What are you going to put the tariff rate on the rest of the world? What amount? What is that going to be? Listen to something Trump says, because it's something that you bring up in your article, and I realize after the fact, he has a point, meaning you have a point.
For the world.
What percent will that? You said you were going to set essentially a tariff for the rest of the world, but the world.
For the world.
What percent will that tariff be?
I would say it'll be somewhere in the 15 to 20% range.
So maybe 15 or 20 or?
No, I said, I sort of know, but I just want to be nice. I would say in the range of 15 to 20%.
Okay. You made the point that if that's true, and that what Europe is getting is a 15% tariff, then the entire world is getting around a 15 to 20% tariff, which means that all of it is effectively muted because all of it is effectively the same. Effectively, Americans, are going to pay a higher rate on the products that they get, but it's not like you're getting a product from Europe and it's more expensive than a product you get from rando country. Go into that for us, because the headlines, screaming headlines were, oh my God, von der Leyen is humiliated. Oh my God, von der Leyen sold out Europe. This is horrible. I think even my headline was like a shocking defeat of Europe or something to that effect. The guest that I had on yesterday, he pointed out, he disagreed with me on this. And I'm realizing that maybe this is more theatrical than what it came across as. Give me a take on this.
Yeah, look, I think that there's a few layers to this, and it's worth trying to peel those layers and work our way through, because these sorts of issues are invariably complex. The question about whether or not the European Union, under its current leadership in particular, so I normally just call them Brussels, right, just to distinguish them from Europe more broadly. So Brussels, the view from Brussels, in many regards, had long sold out the rest of Europe. So the idea that the current event, which was the meeting yesterday in Scotland between President Trump and Ursula von der Leyen, somehow represents a particularly unique event in that scope, I think is probably it's probably forgetting the fact that it was long sold out. The point that I make about the deal, if you will, and I make really 2 points. The first point is that, in fact, the Ursula von der Leyen was negotiating in part from a position of relative weakness, but she was largely viewing the world through the prism of Brussels and how Brussels saw its priorities. And its priorities and its greatest fear was the military abandonment of Europe by the United States. So over the course of the last 6 months, particularly under the Trump presidency, there have from time to time been noises coming out of Washington that Trump was going to withdraw arms supplies to Ukraine. He was trying to push the Europeans to spend more. There was all this talk that the United States really had priorities in other parts of the world. Yeah. And so Brussels, and there's actually 2 nodes in Brussels, but they're very well coordinated. So we're talking about NATO and the European Commission, were petrified that the comforts that they'd become used to of the American safety security blanket was going to disappear. And for them, the overriding objective was actually to tie the United States in. And they've tried a lot of things over the course of the last 6 months to increasingly draw the United States back into the conflict in Europe. And in fact, if you look at the evolution of the engagement from the 20th of January, when Trump was inaugurated, to today, you would say that the level of engagement in a conceptual sense and a rhetorical sense, at least from the president, is totally different today than it was then. So coming into the election, through the election, and then in the early period of his current presidency, the talk was always about ending the war, the forever wars. This wasn't his war. It was a pointless activity, etc., etc. Today, of course, Trump, in effect, is owning the war. So the European Commission and NATO have actually been incredibly successful, together with their allies inside the Beltway, to bringing the administration that, from their point of view, was a risk because it was vacillating, back to their game. Okay, so the first point is actually that this negotiation event that took place, if you can call it that, in Scotland, reaffirmed that as the priority out of Brussels. So von der Leyen basically agreed to everything that Trump wanted, and then on top of that, committed to purchasing $750 million worth of American military industrial complex output. So in that schema, she understood Trump, I think, very, very well. A lot of people have a very negative view of von der Leyen for lots of understandable reasons. But there is a tendency, as a result of having a very critical perspective of her policy stances and her general approach to Europe's interests or not, to also think that she's entirely incompetent or bereft of any basic nous. And having worked in amongst people in high office, one thing I will say is that they often come with a certain degree of sewer rat cunning, and have a very keen sense of personal survival. And I think that some of those instincts came to play. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this idea that she totally ratted out Europe. Now, the claim on that front is that she, the tariff stuff, which I'll come back to because that was the core of your question, but the promises of the $600 billion investment and the $250 billion a year LNG purchase, as well as the military industrial complex acquisitions. Now, when you look seriously at these commitments, you actually realize that they're basically undeliverable. On the investment one, we actually saw within 24 hours an article in Politico, which reported that the EU itself admitted that it had no way of making this promise real. It couldn't enforce it. It wasn't the European Union or the European Commission's money. It was expected to be private capital from private enterprises. So it's never going to happen. The second one, which is the $250 billion per year purchase of LNG, simply won't materialize. And it's got nothing to do with intentions. But we saw, again, in Reuters overnight, analysts commenting that there are actually some serious practical reasons why it simply won't happen. The practical reasons is the supply chain.
Right.
There's simply not enough, cheap enough, available feedstock out of the shale oil fields. There's limits to the processing capacity in the United States. There's limits to storage. There's limits to transportation, and there's limits to storage in Europe itself. Right? So it's not going to happen. So that's the second one down. Now, whether or not von der Leyen understood that her promises were never going to materialize because of real-world material constraints, who knows, right? Maybe she didn't understand that, or maybe she actually did. And the military-industrial complex stuff was a classic. Just hang on.
Oh,
And it was a classic in the sense that when you look at the state of the American military-industrial complex, it's actually operating at more or less peak capacity.
Right.
It is behind in billions of dollars of orders already globally, and it is not in a position to catch up. So the promises of spending more money on the American military-industrial complex, unless the American military-industrial complex reprioritized their production systems and their production line, simply isn't going to see any of this commitment converted into reality. So why is all this happening? It's happening in large part, Jamal, because it enables big numbers to be announced. So that's the first thing. So in large part, this is about theatre, the announceable big numbers. The second thing, and I think this is definitely the case in relation to the industrial systems, and in one of my recent articles, I talked in detail about the Boeing situation, right? So Boeing wasn't part of this European discussions,
Right.
Probably because we've got Airbus in Europe. But Trump has been selling Boeings to everyone else he could, find, and Boeing itself is 300 and is about 5,000 aeroplanes on the backlog. That's about 10 to 12 years of production. They're not catching up anytime soon. Trump sold 350 Boeings, and all of that is going into the backlog. And in these instances, what's happening with these orders is that for publicly listed companies, they're announcing them and then leveraging them as off-balance sheet opportunities to secure structured finance, to improve the valuation of businesses and to support cash flow. So this is a financialization activity. That's what's going on. So that's
just sort of, I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to make sure the audience understands that they're effectively taking on those and saying, hey, we have these unfunded items that are supposed to come up. And then
So what we've got, so Boeing is a great example. So Boeing secures via the high-level agreements achieved MOUs and intents to purchase. Some of those intents may even become orders, but even if they don't become orders, they're treated as high probability of becoming real because they come with political imprimatur. So they are announced to the market. Boeing is a publicly listed company, and it is obligated to make announcements to the market that are material to the operations of the company. And so Boeing has announced these additional orders as part of its forward order book. These orders don't necessarily go onto the financial balance sheet per se, but they do function as a security for finance providers on the basis that they are almost as good as having contracts in place.
Right.
And some of them will fall over in the future, right? But some of them won't. And so these forward positions are used to enable companies like Boeing to raise finance to support operations, cash flow, and OPEX, basically. So that's what's going on in large part. And it, of course, boosts valuations. The tariffs one is really interesting. So we need to really understand how it is that tariffs, in theory, can work. So tariffs are a tax on a particular category of products. Right? And those products are imported products. So that's the first thing to understand, that it is a tax that is applied to imported products. It's applied in large part so as to level out the price disadvantage that domestic producers have compared to the import products. Mm-hmm. So if the domestic product, something similar, costs $200 and the imported product costs $100, if you wanted to equalize that to make the pricing situation equivalent, you'd have to add 100% tariff on the imported good. And with the tariff on top, the product is now costing $200 into the marketplace. So that's the first core idea to understand about tariffs. The aim is to level out the competitive price disadvantage or differential between domestically produced things and similar or equivalent imported things. Now, why do you want to do that? Well, the policy objective in doing that is to support the domestic producer in the face of stiff price competition. That's one. But the other reason is to penalize the importer to a point where they will consider stopping importing, or from the exporter's point of view, stopping exporting goods into the United States and moving the factory to the United States and operating there. So if I use the example that I used before of the $200 versus the $100, if you wanted to move the producer of the $100 thing and have them set up a factory in the United States, you would need not only to hit them with a 100% tariff on their $100 product, you would need to hit them with a 110% tariff, so that the imported good is now disadvantaged against domestic production, causing the company to say, gee, our products are too expensive now in the US market, but we know how to make this stuff, and we can go into the US market and set up a factory there and make things and sell them for $200. So that's the theory. Now, if you did that, the aim then is to say, okay, are we going to target products of a certain type? It could be motor cars, it could be steel, it could be rubber ducks. It doesn't matter what it is. You could target products by product types, categories of things. They may be for strategic reasons. They may be because there's political constituencies that support, certain things, whatever it happens to be. Another way of using tariffs is to target products from particular countries. And you can do that, obviously, to try to impact the businesses in those countries with a few possible objectives in mind. One is to cause them to relocate. One is to cause them pain. Another one is to cause them to set up shop in your own country. What has happened over the course of the last 6 years with the tariffs from the first Trump administration is where they have caused companies to seek to relocate, they've relocated to other lower cost producing areas and continue to export to the United States. And so the United States now, in Trump 2.0, is in a position where it continues to be concerned about the financial trade deficit. It is frustrated by the fact that tariffs 1.0 didn't lead to companies setting up in America, but actually just arbitraged the system and moved to other low-cost producing areas and essentially got around the first round of tariffs, which are targeted principally at China. And now they're saying, well, we're going to stop this thing called transshipment, right? And so they're going to apply tariffs right across the board. Right? That'll teach them a lesson. There won't be these little countries where there's a little tariff shadow where I can, sneak off to and repackage something or set up a little cheap factory and then send it on to America. Nope, there'll be tariffs across the board. Well, the minute you do that, you've actually just raised the prices of everybody. And the minute that happens, you haven't changed the relative price differential. And unless there is relative price differential, you actually don't achieve your objectives that you set out to achieve. So in the end, everybody's price goes up when they land in the United States, and they go up by roughly the same percentage. Yeah. So we're back to square one. The difference now is that the United States will be confronted with an environment where products across the board are levied with a tariff. So what happens? The simple story is, well, the consumers will pay. There is actually a slightly more complex story, and it tends to unfold in some phases. The first phase is that importers will seek to negotiate with the producers to absorb the price difference. So if there's a 10% tariff, you try to negotiate a 10% discount. Sometimes that can happen, right? It really depends on negotiating power and market power. Well, that hasn't happened this time. The second thing that happens is that the importer absorbs that tariff and doesn't pass it on. And in fact, that tends to be what happens mostly. The importer, in the first instance, will say, I'm going to suck this up. I'll pay the tariff. You got to remember that when goods land, the department that handles customs evaluates the value of the import based on the paperwork, and then issues what is in effect an invoice to the importer or the import agent for the tariff amount. And until that tariff is paid, usually, the goods don't leave. Right? So you've got to pay the tariff and then the goods leave. So the importer is stuck in a position where they're saying, well, I've got to pay the tariff so that the goods can leave. Will I pass on some or all of that tariff to my downstream customer? And in the first instance, what happens typically is that the importer absorbs it in the hope of not losing the customer, because they're worried that if they pass on the price, their competitor won't, and they'll lose the customer. So all the importers in the first round try to keep pricing the same. But you can only do that for so long until your own margins and your own cash flow are impacted, and you have no choice but to begin passing on the costs. The other thing that happens is that some companies actually begin increasing prices under the cover of tariffs, even if they aren't directly affected by tariffs. So they're exploiting market confusion to increase pricing anyway. And we call this sellers' inflation. Right? So the sellers, even when they're not affected, are exploiting this general tariff mayhem and all this news and information and confusion, and they increase their prices anyway. So the typical result is that prices do go up, and the United States is going to be forced, in effect, to adjust to a higher cost, lower standard of living economic system. So this is the sort of pattern that is unfolding. And of course, like any system, Jamal, it will and can adapt, right? But this is what's going to happen. And you'll notice about 2 months ago, the talk became, well, instead of American consumers being, the thing that everyone in the world desired, it became, well, it's about time Americans pulled their belt in a bit and stopped buying 60 Barbie dolls and only bought 2. And so we shifted from the American consumer as this cultural icon to the idea that the modern American consumer really is the epitome of thrift. And that to me was a fascinating cultural shift, because it actually admitted that tariffs were going to affect the spending power of American businesses and American households. So that's what's going on, I think.
Yeah. They're so contradictory, because Trump will make the argument prices aren't going to go up. And then he'd get angry at Jeff Bezos for potentially listing the price differential on the items as they, adjust their prices because of the tariffs that Donald Trump is passing. And to make this even worse, this idea of we're going to take in this money from tariffs, we're going to pass a tax cut to the rich, and we're going to have the poor and middle class, who have the least amount of spending income, pay effectively that money. Because, as you point out, we are the ones who are effectively going to ultimately end up paying that. Whereas people like Bezos, Musk, Trump are going to get a fantastic tax cut.
Look, there's a great book actually on inflation by a Scottish economist who has worked in the US for a very long time, whose name I've forgotten at the moment. It's been published this year, and it basically speaks of inflation not as a singular experience, right, which is what we often think of. The CPI rates 2.8 or 3.2, or whatever it is, right? Yeah. So there's this sense that there's this single measure. He actually looks into the demographic distribution of inflation as a proportion, or as a disproportionate impact on different income groups. And it is very clear that the lower the income, the greater the impact inflation has. And high-income households actually don't experience inflation in the way that low-income households do. The other thing that high-income households get the benefit from in terms of inflation is asset inflation. Right? So don't forget that as assets inflate, houses, land, capital, shares, stocks, etc., those households that own those things are actually benefiting from an improvement to their balance sheet. So asset inflation benefits the wealthy disproportionately. Consumer product inflation impacts the poor disproportionately.
Yeah, because the poor has to buy groceries, baby food. They don't have a choice. And so they're stuck with that cost.
Yeah.
Wow. I want to go to something else. By the way, how do you think this is ultimately going to turn out? I mean, my assessment several months ago was stagflation, that ultimately you're going to get a recession and you're going to get people's standard of living going down. Is that accurate?
Look, I think the risk is that living standards are going to continue going down for the majority of Americans. That's actually not in the interests of the majority of Americans, obviously, but it's not in the interest of anyone else in the world either. Nobody in the world actually has an interest in an impoverished America. People have an interest in other countries doing well, especially when you are involved in trade and other things with them. You want other countries to be doing well. Unfortunately, I think that there is a high probability that the United States is going to experience, as I said, an adjustment to a higher cost and a lower standard of living economic system. That's the first thing that's going to happen, and that will, that could potentially lead to all sorts of ramifications. I don't know how serious they will be because it depends a bit on how deep and how long these impacts are. But it's fair to say that when over 60% of American households report that they live paycheck to paycheck already, that over 20% of households report that they skip meals to pay mortgages or rent, that 13% of households are estimated by the US Department of Agriculture to be experiencing food insecurity in the United States. Add to that the personal debts and the rising delinquency rates. I think you've got a household sector that is already living on the edge. And as the impact of inflation starts to feed through into the system, the risk is that we're going to start to see some very, very serious social consequences, which could be quite destabilizing domestically. So higher inflation, lower economic growth, stagflation, rising unemployment, lower standards of living for the time being at least, possibly an increasingly disenfranchised working class. And as an anecdote, I can sort of probably add, just so that your viewers can fully visualize this. One area that has been growing in terms of demand in the last 12 months or so and is projected to grow by about 12% compounded over the next 5 years is demand for bulletproof glass. And that tells you something, right?
Yeah.
So a growing number of households, wealthy, are installing bulletproof glass. And there's probably a reason why they're doing that.
Bring on the revolution, right? Bring on the revolution.
Who knows what will happen, right? Social disquiet can build up a head of steam and become a sort of a congealed energy. But it's hard to know what direction it takes. And it's hard to know whether it fizzles out, whether it fragments, or whether it's contained in different parts of the country. Can small sparks become prairie fires? How does that get, let's call it, governed and managed by authorities, right? Trying to be as bland as I can, really, but if you're in the business of trying to maintain, let's call it, stability and calm in a community through policing, and things emerge that begin to disrupt the peace of the neighborhood, the risk is that policing gets pretty heavy-handed. And and we see this already, right? We see this on the news already, and so I do wonder, and I worry. I have many good friends who live in the United States, and I worry that the social situation is going to disintegrate, creating a lot of making America into an unsafe place, and again, that's actually not in the interests of anybody in the world.
I'll give you a tangible example. The health CEO that got murdered and the country cheered. They applauded. They applauded. They call him a hero. That is pretty astonishing, right? A man gets murdered and the country applauds. Everybody hates healthcare companies in states, or at least people who have to pay for them or can't afford them. There's that. One other thing with that, Europe, 15% is still going to, on some level, damage European companies, correct? I mean, Europe is weird to me. For one, they've been putting all of this money out for defense that has been fleeing to the United States. I mean, we're talking about, 70% of the weapons, give or take. My number may be off, but it's not too far off, are coming out of the United States. So that's money coming out of the US. The sanctions went after Russian energy, something that was stable from the standpoint of Europe, or that no longer became stable. So they were paying 4 to 5 times as much coming out of the US for LNG, or Saudi Arabia, India, which was just Russian gas that they were playing the market for. And so they were seeing this kind of deindustrialization coming out of Europe, especially Germany. This can't be great for them. I mean, especially even if all of the prices are equal at 15%, you're still effectively looking at an American product at one price and a European product at another price, which is going to affect consumer behavior for them to buy the American product. Well, that's incentive anyway. But correct me if I'm wrong on this.
Well, it'll affect all products because prices will go up, and therefore demand's going to fall anyway, right? So European producers will feel this, along with exporters from other countries, and because that's the whole point, right? You're trying to make things more expensive so that they don't compete as effectively with domestic alternatives. That's the objective, and 20%, 15%, depending on your industry, is going to certainly cause some cash flow pain. It's going to impact revenues, obviously, as sales fall, but that's going to be across the board. And so in a relative sense, you'd say that it is no worse than the next country. But obviously, when all countries are experiencing a reduction in demand from the United States, they're going to be affected, on day one. The question is going to be how those industries and enterprises adapt to this new world. Can they find new markets? How do they do that? How do they compensate for the reduction in demand from the US market? Mm-hmm. Some industries and some enterprises will adapt better than others. The European situation is particularly challenging because the industrial sectors are already in a high cost operating environment, in large part courtesy of the problems with the energy supply in Europe, and that puts them in a very perilous position to be able to adjust and respond. They're not well positioned. Whereas if you look at firms in China, which are operating in very low energy cost environments, intensely competitive, incredibly lean operations, thin margins, high volume, they are in a position to move quickly into new markets and secure positions because they're offering high quality goods at incredibly low prices. So the challenge for Europe is to think through how it adapts in the first instance to this change in American demand, And secondly, how it structurally adapts in the longer term so that its industries are less exposed to the vicissitudes, the rises and falls, and the capriciousness of one major market. They're longer term problems, and it's hard to see, based on recent experience, observing the ways in which the European Commission has made its public policy decisions, that Europe in aggregate is well placed to handle this new environment. Now, what will this do? Well, it seems to me that this will continue to antagonize the emerging and bubbling centrifugal forces in Europe that are actually pulling Europe as a Western collective whole. The European Union is, in a sense, pulling it apart. And I say that in an analytical and descriptive sense without trying to be normative. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's not for me to say necessarily. The point is, at the moment, is that there are clearly tensions between different countries around direction. And there are also significant and growing differences, it seems, within countries about various policies of those countries vis-a-vis the rest of Europe and Europe at large. So there's a lot going on now in the European body politic that lends itself to destabilizing the institutions of the European Union and the institutions of the European Commission. Whether that is what is needed for Europe as a whole to get the shake-up that it needs, I guess that's a matter for Europeans. But it seems to me, observing and trying to understand what's going on, that these forces are at work. The decisions that are being made by Brussels in the interests of Brussels priorities are actually exacerbating these tensions and dynamics. And so in some respects, what Brussels is doing is like an autoimmune reaction, where a belief that you're attacking the cause of your ailment is actually leading you to attack your healthy cells and kill yourself from the inside. And the risk of Europe at the moment is autoimmunity gone off track, off the rails.
Wow. One last question that I want to get you before you go. Secondary tariffs. So Donald Trump put out, I'm calling it a bluff. I called it a bluff before because Russia's not going to acknowledge it. But effectively a 50-day ultimatum that was never going to be honored. That was never going to be acknowledged. Russia is not going to stop their military campaign just because Donald Trump, an untrustworthy actor across the board, has an utterance. I mean, in the States, they call him Taco Trump for a reason. Trump's always capitulates, whatever the acronym is. These are supposed to be 100% secondary sanctions on products coming out of Russia. I believe oil products or gas products coming out of Russia. What is going to be the effect of this? Because Russia's effectively said, we don't care. Do whatever you want. You have no capacity to affect our behavior. We have dealt with sanctions. This is like 24,000, 21,000 sanctions, some insane number. We're still moving along and we're still profitable. We don't care. But that is going to directly affect countries like India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, China, obviously. And I can't see how this works. The United States is trying to woo India. It's trying to come up with some kind of trade deal with China. It's supposed to be an ally with Saudi Arabia. I don't see how this is going to function in reality. But give me your take on this. You may have a different take.
Yeah, look, it's I think you're right in describing the current presidency as increasingly erratic and unreliable, right? So it's hard to now engage with the White House on the basis that what it says it does.
Right.
We've seen this already in the way that the Iran question was handled. Whilst talks were happening, bombs were launched.
Yeah.
Promises made are frequently broken. And so I think that that's the first thing, is that most other countries are actually factoring in this erratic nature in their dealings. So they're very guarded now about anything that comes out from the White House. The second thing is to remember what these secondary sanctions or the secondary tariffs are meant to do. And again, they are meant to penalize countries that buy Russian energy products by levying a tariff on products that those countries then export to the United States. What's interesting about this is that you've got, as you say, a ongoing discussion with China about a trade agreement. And in the last 24 hours, the 90-day deadline for that one has been extended again. So it's been extended for the third time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that in between all of this, there's the threat of the 100% tariffs on Chinese goods as the secondary, punishment, or even Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing tariffs of 500%.
Right.
So you've got confusion. You've now got the president saying that the tariffs for everyone else in the world will be 15 to 20%. So again, you've got 15 to 20%, you've got 90 days, you've got 50 days, you've got 12 or 10 days, you've got 500%, you've got 100%. So in that sense, it's an environment where I think it is impossible for serious counterparties to, in a sense, engage other than perhaps think through some possible scenarios. One scenario that I think we can be reasonably sure of is that none of them will stop trading with Russia. And so they will ignore the threat and in a sense lay down the gauntlet. Is that calling the bluff? Well, we'll know when President Trump reacts. The difficulty is that if you look at the timelines now and these secondary sanctions are imposed, he would need to act probably somewhere in the order of 70 odd days before the third deadline came into effect for the China discussions. So, how is this going to unfold? My sense is that most of these countries have already made it quite clear to Russia that they won't be yielding to these sorts of threats. They will continue their trade because it's in their own national interest to do so. There may be other reasons why they continue to do this in terms of ensuring that Russia is not isolated in the world, and they will have broader geopolitical reasons for that. And also, of course, to make it clear to the rest of the world that countries like this, particularly large ones, simply won't yield to being bullied. So I think where we're heading to, as all of this begins to consolidate or congeal, is a hastening of the processes of decentering of the United States economy. Often people say that the US is in decline. And as we touched on before, there are some things that are happening which probably lends themselves to that kind of description, particularly the social issues, the longevity issues, the infant mortality questions, etc. They do lend themselves to thinking about the United States as in some kind of a decline. But in global terms, I tend to think that a more constructive way of describing what's happening and then analyzing what's happening is to see the system evolving where what's going on is that the United States is being progressively decentered. It's not unimportant. It's a big place. 350 million people, big economy, big military. It's not, on the bare bones of its bum. But it's no longer the center of the universe. And what's happening is that I think these actions by the White House is simply putting the accelerator down on the forces that have been driving decentering for the last 30 years. And we're going to wake up in 5 years' time, hopefully without nuclear fallout, with a world in which the United States will continue to be decentered. It won't be replaced by another big center. There are too many centers now coming up. And so we are seeing a multinodal ecosystem evolving, where the connective tissue between countries is much more complex. It's no longer a simple hubs and spokes world. It's really going to look like a spider's web, with crisscrossing connections, with plenty of options. Right? So no single country is exposed to the whims of someone else. And it will be more complex. At times it will be a little bit more messy, and where conflicts don't get resolved by the big guy just telling you how things are going to be. And we're starting to see that, of course, play out. But where conflicts and differences invariably have to be resolved through, the tedious and time-consuming work of good old-fashioned statecraft.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're heading. Well, I hope that's where we're heading.
I would say you hope that's where we're heading, because alternative. I mean, I think my concern is that the U.S. It doesn't. In chess, it's always like there's an acronym. Well, it's not acronym, but it's a common knowledge that if you're a drawing position where you try to win it, you lose it. If it is a draw, then it is a draw. Then it is a draw. You're pushing hard in order to try to make the draw into a win. You often lose it. The U.S. doesn't seem to acknowledge that is the world that we're living in. And so you get Donald Trump, who seems to be this kind of last gasp. And I do think it's decline. I mean, how do you get a president that's incompetent? Or for that matter, Joe Biden, same thing. I mean, it's not like these guys have been brilliant people who are involved in statecraft. They've gotten to the point of just trying to scream at the world, which is what Donald Trump is, screaming at the world, dishonest, all of that stuff.
Look, they're symptoms, right? They're really symptoms of a deep sense of displacement anxiety, and I think a sense of grief as well. There was a time when, America was the unquestioned primate, but that no longer exists. That era is over, and so there's a grief involved because that's lost. And unsurprisingly, when you're experiencing displacement anxiety, when you're going through grief, you're very angry, and the risk we run is, of course, the consequences of an America lashing out, trying to reclaim its lost mantle. That's the risk. And that's why I say I hope that the process leads to a relatively ordered decentering. I say relatively ordered because I don't think that this is going to be smooth at all. Clearly it's not. It's just a question of how rough it gets. And here in Asia, we're going to be, in many ways, at the epicenter of it because, to some extent, this question of Taiwan and America's power projection in the Western Pacific, which it has dominated for 75 years, is in some regards going to be the last stand. And how America's retrenchment from the region can be effected without a sense of grotesque national humiliation, I think is going to be an important challenge, not so much for America, but actually for the rest of the world, because America is going to get pushed out of this region over the next 10 to 20 years. It's just going to be a question of how it is pushed out of the region and how people view it being pushed out of the region. And provided that this change of circumstance in the region is not at least explicitly construed as an American humiliation, but that in fact this is an evolution that leads to a good outcome all round, then we might land a little bit softer than we might otherwise.
I guess I bristle at this idea of, yes, I understand the humiliation part. I understand of the loss part. But this is kind of like a Crimea River thing. Like
Yeah,
the United States had all of these resources, all of the things that it could have done with its resources. And instead, we pissed away $10 trillion murdering and killing people in Iraq and deciding to reshape the Middle East. We're doing the same thing with Taiwan, where we're trying to start a war with China because, hashtag we're America, we're primacy, and we can tell people what to do. Yeah, this is a Crimea River thing. I feel you. I agree with everything you're saying.
Don't get me started. I'm, in a sense, when I articulate this particular approach, it doesn't necessarily always reflect sometimes how I feel, but because in many ways, Crimea River, you can be very angry on behalf of people, but at the same time, I keep reminding myself, are we just trying to, in a sense, settle a score? Because that is a very natural reaction, right? Or are we just trying to get to the next phase as unscathed as we all can? And that, in a sense, I get why the instinct is the first. Trust me. But I guess I hope that whilst we can understand why that is the instinct for many people, you'll notice that across the global south, most people don't talk like that or think like that. But you can be absolutely certain, as I'm sure you know, that people across the global south have not forgotten, and in fact probably have never forgiven either. But they put that to one side and focus on the betterment of their own lives and the betterment of their own communities, because that's a better place to commit energy and effort.
I was born and raised here. It's my bones. It's kind of what it is. And by the way, I'm not talking about settling scores. It's just this idea of, and I guess I use the war. I was saying that in the context of you had all of this money, you have all of these resources, you had a primacy position, and you didn't use it like China. You decided to use it in the sense of, hey, I need to pay my oligarchs more. I give an example, the Big Beautiful Bill. They're cutting, as you pointed out, infant mortality rates. We die, 5 years younger than Europeans, and yet they're taking nearly $1 trillion out of Social Security. I'm sorry, out of Medicaid. We barely have a healthcare system in the context of people's ability to pay for this stuff. SNAP benefits, again, taking massive amounts of money. I think it's the largest pool of money from SNAP benefits, which is feeding children. And they're using that money to give oligarchs more money. And I'm saying this is what this country is. And so the idea that where you've had a declining society as a direct result of the policy choices that you've made, and then you turn around and say, it's the world's fault. And so we're going to lash out at the world. Yeah, that's a bit rich.
Look, as people who followed me on Twitter will often see me talk about America needing to own its own problems, right? And blaming other people for its own problems isn't going to help it. And this is precisely what you're describing. But these are systemic things too, right? So over the course of the last 50, 60 years, American financialization has been central to the way its political economy has been organized. And unsurprisingly, it's coincided with the destruction of industries and the destruction of the kinds of jobs that those industries brought. It wasn't because China came and stole those jobs, or before China, somebody else, right? So this has been going on for 45, 50 years. And whilst change is kind of inevitable, the question you ask yourself is, as places change and as old industries die or old jobs disappear because of new technologies or whatever, what is being done to ensure that the displaced people aren't left behind? And some places do a much better job of making sure that there isn't a left behind mess that essentially accumulates for 3 generations, but does something constructive to ensure that people who are displaced as a result of structural change can find something else meaningful to do. The United States simply has not done that. It has gone through significant structural change, that's one of the reasons why we have the politics today that we do. But that structural change was never accompanied by the kinds of public policy interventions that was needed to make sure that the place didn't begin to fall apart. I
Right.
mean, I spent time driving through the Appalachians, for example, and that is a classic example of communities that in effect were abandoned, right? As industry shut down, the state government turned its back on them. And unsurprisingly, 2 generations later, you've got a bunch of really angry people who feel that the promises of the American dream have actually just become a forever nightmare. And this is where we're at, right? So it is a country that if you were given a choice of a place with the resources around the world to choose to go to, the North American continent would have to be the most abundant, fertile, safe, prosperous opportunity land that there could ever have been on the face of this earth. The rivers that run through it, the rich soils that there are, it is one of the most amazing, fertile parts of this earth. And yet, what have we got? You know, we've got people who 13% who don't have enough food. 13%. Right? That's remarkable. But does this lead in the end? And this is really my question to my American friends: is, you know, does this lead in the end to substantial structural change in the political economy, or doesn't it? And I guess, you know, we're all sitting here watching and waiting to see how American citizens respond. Now, we've seen one response already with the election of President Trump. It was a response, right?
Yeah.
But will there be a response to the response, often from the same people? Right? So this isn't, you know, the blue guys coming back. This is the same people being doubly angry that what they thought was going to happen never did, and they feel even more let down than they've ever felt before.
Mhm.
Will that trigger, you know, the kinds of significant structural changes that I suspect are called for? I don't know.
Warwick Powell, thank you for this. I really appreciate this conversation. I really do. Warwick Powell, he's an adjunct professor at Queensland University, professor working at the intersection of China, digital technologies, supply chains, financial flows, and global political economy and governance. I really, really appreciated this. I hope you're willing to come back. Thank you for this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a great conversation. Thanks, Jamal, and thanks for the work that you do.
Oh man, thank you. Be safe. Thank you.